Washington, D.C., and they found him dead inside a shabby cabin in Tennessee. Now, his death was a little bit controversial, and I'm going to show you a video on that. I think you'll enjoy. His death was a little bit controversial because most accounts agree he suffered 2 gunshot wounds. Well, that would be maybe difficult to kill yourself and shoot yourself twice, but I'll show you the video and let you decide. So reports of his death were mixed. Most accounts agree he suffered 2 gunshot wounds. However, really murder or suicide is not really clear today. And I'm going to show you a video, a short video, and you can kind of see what you think about whether Lewis was murdered or he committed suicide. William Clark, on the other hand, was much more successful. He was appointed governor of the Missouri Territory. And they also promoted him from captain to brigadier general after the expedition. So William Clark was appointed governor of the Missouri Territory after the return, and also was promoted from Captain William Clark to Brigadier General William Clark after the expedition. Yep. William Clark was appointed governor of the Missouri Territory and also promoted from Captain to Brigadier General. What do you ask me? Brigadier. Brigadier is spelled B-R-I-G-A-D-I-E-R. B-R-I-G-A-D-I-E-R. Know another who is the youngest brigadier general in the history of our country? Anybody know that? George somebody. George Custer. We'll talk about him later. Okay? Clark married a childhood friend. Although this will get eyebrows because you guys are in a new millennium. After she died, he married her cousin. Oh. I mean, that's not, if he married his cousin, it might be different. Okay? So, Clark died on, Clark married a childhood friend, and after her death, he married her cousin. And finally, on September 1st, 1838, William Clark died, a genuine American hero at the age of 77. So on September 1st, 1838, William Clark died, a genuine American hero at the age of 77. Now, who else might we be interested in what happened? Sacagawea. This is kind of a weird deal. According to history, Sacagawea died a young woman in 1812, although there are rumors out there that it was not her, and she actually lived to be over 100 years old in kind of a different identity. That's a little bit of a mystery according to Indian folklore. So according to history, she died at a pretty young age in 1812. But there are those rumors out there, especially through Indian folklore, that she lived to be over 100 years old. So really the mystery of Sacagawea's death is high also. Nobody really knows, or it wasn't really justified or verified totally. Okay? Well, what happened when Sacagawea died or maybe went missing? What happened to Pomp? Clark adopted him. William Clark adopted him. That away, Blaine. And Pomp later became famous. He toured Europe in the company of royalty. But you know, he took a different life. He actually became a mountain man and died in Oregon at the age of 61. So he, at first, when he was adopted by William Clark, he became pretty famous for being part of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the lore of living with William Clark. He toured Europe. He was treated very well by the royalty in Europe as a kind of an American hero as well, because he was tied in with the Lewis and Clark expedition. But after that, he grew tired of that life, and he actually became a mountain man and lived a pretty long life for a mountain man, dying in Oregon at the age of 61. Okay, kind of finish up those notes if you would. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of shorts. You've done a nice job of taking notes. So I'm going to show you a couple of shorts here. Now let me kind of tell you what's going to happen. We're kind of moving away from the Lewis and Clark expedition to what? Jefferson's administration, right? So there's other things that happened during Jefferson's administration other than the Lewis and Clark expedition. So that's what we'll continue to deal with later. But I do want to show you, you guys have been really good at hammering through these notes since the semester started. So I want to show you a little video here, a couple videos that deal with the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I think you'll enjoy it. Now, if you're taking some extra, you know, if you hear something in here that you haven't heard, don't be afraid to jot it down. Might end up on a test sometime. Okay, first thing I'm going to show you just about a 15-minute short about Lewis and Clark, and that'll end the day. And then tomorrow we're going to watch the video on the controversy over Lewis's death. And for those of you that aren't here, I'll record it so you can watch it on the screen. Not really. Nice. In the name of history. We'll still do it. Okay, let's pay attention. This is really pretty good.
Sacagawea, the only Native American woman to appear on a U.S. coin, $1 no less. But how much of what we know about her in the Lewis and Clark expedition are heady facts, and which part are tall tales? Here's how the story goes. It's the real estate deal of the century. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson pays France $15 million for 828,000 square miles of territory, the Louisiana Purchase, instantly doubling the size of the United States. A few months later, Jefferson asked two frontiersmen, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to go explore the area. Clad in buckskin, they and their team will be the first white men to cross the Great Plains and immediately enlist a Native American woman, Sacagawea, as their pathfinder. They brave countless dangers, but with Sacagawea's guidance, the party makes it all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back. Their triumphant return, 2.5 years later, thrills the young nation, and the two are immediately heralded as international heroes. The myths in that account are as big as the Louisiana Purchase itself. Let's start with the buckskin-clad duo Jefferson chose for the mission.
Meriwether Lewis was Thomas Jefferson's private secretary, and so Jefferson chose him to lead the mission. William Clark had been Lewis's commander in a rifle company, and Lewis chose him to be his number 2.
Despite all the art and imagery of Lewis and Clark and their coonskin caps and their buckskin suits, truth of the matter was this was a military operation, and the men wore military uniforms.
So in 1804, looking more like soldiers than naturalists, Lewis and Clark and their 33 men set off from St. Louis.
Lewis and Clark are the ideal explorers because they kept extremely detailed journals and maps, and both of them did it. So it's ideal for tracing exactly what the route was.
That's how we know that 6 months into their adventure, Lewis and Clark arrive in North Dakota and meet the Shoshone woman they recruit as their invaluable pathfinder, 16-year-old Sacagawea.
Modern myth tells us that Sacagawea was the pathfinder for Lewis and Clark. Based on the writings of Lewis, Clark, and many of the men, she wasn't. In fact, she only led on 2 occasions.
She wasn't brought on the trip as a guide. Her real role was an interpreter.
Another largely forgotten fact about Sacagawea is that she has a husband, a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. He's enlisted as an interpreter, too. And shortly after both join the expedition, she gives birth to his son.
In addition to facilitating communication, she did have another very important role in the expedition. According to the Native American traditions, a woman, especially one with a little baby, would never be sent along with a war party.
Lewis and Clark recognized that having a woman and a child with your military expedition sent a sign to everyone you met that you came in peace. And then Sacagawea could say that in Shoshone, we come in peace.
As Lewis and Clark continue on their journey, there comes a point in time when they realize they need more help. Their real pathfinders are 3 Native Americans they meet during their journey, who stick around only long enough to show them the way.
Old Toby, Tito Harska, and Twisted Hair were guides for the expedition, and countless members of other tribes helped them throughout their journey.
Even though Sacagawea doesn't play the precise role she's famous for, she's still a very valuable team player. Not just as a translator, but also by showing the expedition which plants in the wilderness are edible. She helps Lewis and Clark trek 5,000 miles to the Pacific and back to her home in North Dakota. And when it's time for them to part ways, the 2 great explorers probably say something like, "Thanks, Janie." Hold it. Who's Janie?
The explorers called Sacagawea Janie, and Janie at the time was U.S. Army slang for girl or girly.
Lewis and Clark called her Janie, probably because they couldn't even really completely figure out how to say Sacagawea. They definitely didn't know how to spell it. They spelled it 8 different ways in the journals.
No matter how you spell it, Sacagawea's name can't help but find its way into the history books. She was all but forgotten until she was rediscovered by another American woman who was also exploring a new frontier. Lewis and Clark and their gang existed on a nearly all-meat diet, so they needed a little help staying regular. So they used the aptly named thunderclappers, which were huge pills loaded with mercury chloride as laxatives. The compound lasts virtually forever without breaking down. Scientists now study their heavy metal deposits to trace the expedition's movements. Talk about your toxic waste. On September 23rd, 1806, Lewis and Clark complete their round-trip odyssey, a jaw-dropping 8,000-mile trip from St. Louis to the Pacific and back. Heralded as true pioneers of their day, a trail now exists for all future wagon trains. Well, the miles are right, but the rest comes up short.
Lewis and Clark didn't return to a ticker tape parade. In fact, almost immediately, they went into obscurity.
Lewis and Clark returned, and there was this silence. President Jefferson didn't even tell Congress that they had returned and the trip was a success for 2 months. And then he said it in one sentence, yeah, they're back, and it was a success.
Privately, Jefferson feels the expedition is one big letdown. He had hoped Lewis and Clark would find a waterway across the entire continent, the fabled Northwest Passage. And when they report that doesn't exist, he never makes hyping their accomplishments a priority. So it falls on Lewis and Clark to trailblaze their own success by publishing their journals.
A book that came out in 1814, 8 years after they got back. And it wasn't really popular. It was at the peak of the War of 1812, and I think people just weren't interested at that moment.
Only 1,400 copies are printed. And in the mid-19th century, when pioneers start heading west in large numbers, they use entirely different routes than Lewis and Clark's, because those prove way too difficult to follow.
Lewis and Clark ended up almost completely forgotten.
So how did the 2 obscure Army officers become America's most celebrated explorers? Well, you can thank the good people of St. Louis for that.
But it wasn't until 1904, in the expo that was held at St. Louis, that the organizers of the expo in St. Louis, they were trying to celebrate the anniversary of Louisiana Purchase, but they wanted a St. Louis connection to it. Lewis and Clark started and ended in St. Louis, and so they brought Lewis and Clark into the story of American westward expansion.
The journals themselves were not published until the centennial celebration of the expedition, so 1904, and that really got a lot of interest going. That's when Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea really entered the American mythology.
At the same time, Sacagawea rafts her own wave of popularity, thanks to a 1902 novel written by a suffragette.
Sacagawea was magnified into becoming a mythic character by a woman named Eva Emery Dye, and she was casting about for a new story to write, and she heard that there were going to be centennial celebrations of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So she did a little research into it, and she found Sacagawea, and she screamed, "I have found my hero."
Sacagawea in there was a romanticized, very strong woman who, for readers, exemplified what women could do.
Ignored in their own time, Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea become posthumous heroes to a new generation of Americans. It can take decades to finally honor the heroes of American history. Many times it can take even longer to learn the real stories behind our greatest legends.
Okay, I'm going to start this other one so at least you guys who won't be here tomorrow will get a shot at seeing some of it about the controversy behind Lewis's death here. Kind of interesting facts there. Did you catch a couple facts I didn't tell you? Followed their poop, you know. And Sacagawea was called what? Janie. All right, here we go.
That America's greatest explorer was murdered while carrying secret presidential codes. In 1809, Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark is the sitting governor of the Louisiana Territory when he dies in Tennessee. Lewis, who helped President Thomas Jefferson create one of the very first code of communications used by the White House, was headed to Washington, D.C. He's carrying journals of his expedition to the Pacific and ciphers secret presidential codes at the time of his death. Originally, they ruled it as a suicide based on an official letter, but now there are reasons to believe that the circumstances were way more sinister. Some say that Lewis was murdered for revenge. Others believed it was to stop him from delivering coded messages to Jefferson revealing treason. Many think a cover-up ensued, but I can tell you one thing. When someone dies carrying secret messages to one of the greatest presidents of the United States, I want to know what happened. I'm ready.
Okay, so what do we know about Meriwether Lewis? I know he's half of the Lewis and Clark team.
Yeah, not only half. Meriwether Lewis was an absolute rock star, a national hero. He was selected by Thomas Jefferson as the hand-selected leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which effectively doubled the size of the United States. And at the end of his expedition, Jefferson appointed him governor of the Louisiana Territory.
And these two were really good friends?
Meriwether Lewis was Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary. He trusted no one more.
Here's the thing. Lewis is an American icon, but most people couldn't tell you much about him except for his fabled expedition to the Pacific. Lewis was born near Monticello, Virginia in 1774, and he's given his mother's maiden name, Meriwether. As a child, he's constantly outdoors. He's even believed to have spoken Cherokee. And being from Jefferson's hometown definitely did not hurt him career-wise. He's the first presidential aide ever. He actually lived at the White House. The two men even developed a way to communicate in code, allowing him and the President of the United States to discuss government secrets over long distances. It was so brilliant, the U.S. Army used it for more than 100 years. But when Lewis returned from cataloging the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson appointed him governor of the new territory. This was unheard of for a 35-year-old at the time, and Lewis quickly developed enemies.
So the question we have to figure out is whether he was murdered.
His legacy has been shrouded and tainted by suicide.
Buddy's strength, well, you know that old friend you can tell anything to? That's Buddy. People trust him, people like him, and that means he's great at getting people to reveal information.
The historical record points to suicide. I've always thought it was suicide.
Yeah,
That's what I was
that's all I've ever heard, yeah. I wonder how presidential ciphers figure into it, though.
Sounds like they were communicating through ciphers. I didn't even know that.
So what if he was traveling with some sort of information that never got to the president? I mean, wouldn't you love to know what that information is?
Absolutely, because if we know what the information is, then we know who had a motive to kill him. What were they doing that's so secretive?
McKinley's an engineer, so she's analytical. She only believes what can be proven by science.
What's amazing to me is that after 200 years, a suicide could turn into an unsolved homicide case.
Here's why we need Scott. He's an officer in the U.S. Army Reserve. So his expertise in military operations is exactly what we need in figuring out what happened to Lewis.
We're essentially, in retrospect, accusing someone of murder. We need to look at it carefully.
So Buddy, Mac, and Scott are now headed to the Natchez Trace. It's a rugged 440-mile horse trail through Tennessee. This place was deadly. Bandits and thieves routinely robbed and murdered people there. And because of that, Lewis was by no means traveling alone. He had a military escort, a guy named Major James Neely, who suspiciously was ordered to protect Lewis by Lewis's own greatest enemy, a guy named General James Wilkinson. The general hated Lewis because Jefferson removed the general as the governor of Louisiana and gave the job to his former aide Lewis instead. Oh. There's a theory that General Wilkinson had Lewis assassinated with the help of Major Neely and a handful of other willing participants.
Is that wallet Bobstery?
Okay, we'll stop there. This is really pretty interesting. So those of you that are here tomorrow will get a good look at this, and I'll record it for those of you that are not.